The end arrived not with shouting or spectacle, but with the sterile hush of a frosted glass conference room on the 22nd floor of Skyline Freight Solutions. High enough to see the harbor, but not high enough to feel untouchable. The space had all the warmth of a dentist's waiting room, cold lighting, chrome fixtures, and that faint chemical smell of freshly wiped surfaces. Every sound carried, including the too loud laugh of Colton Avery, Skyline's freshly minted 26-year-old director of cultural reinvention. His laugh ricocheted unnaturally off the glass and marble like a rubber bullet in a mausoleum. He wore a slate suit that was trying too hard to be edgy, and sneakers that would have made sense at a rooftop bar, not at a logistics firm older than he was. Across from him sat Mara Dalton, senior operations architect, the woman who had kept the company's veins unclogged and its arteries pumping for 27 uneventful, indispensable years. Colton steepled his fingers. He'd probably practiced that in a mirror, and informed her she was being off-boarded, delivered with the breezy detachment of someone announcing light rain. Skyline, he explained, needed youth-coded workflows and brand-forward optimization, which was corporate Esperanto for, "You're vintage, and we don't know what to do with people who read manuals instead of mood boards." Dana, the HR representative, attempted professional neutrality but couldn't bring herself to meet Mara's eyes. Perhaps guilt still has some gravitational pull. The interns stared at their shoes like children witnessing a car accident they weren't emotionally equipped to understand. Through the glass walls, employees paused mid-stride, witnessing the quiet execution. Mara didn't cry or tremble or lean into theatrics. Her heartbeat remained steady. Years of crisis management had trained her for this, and losing composure over a boy in designer sneakers felt beneath her. The stillness in her face unnerved Colton. He'd expected begging, maybe tears, something to feed the hungry little god of authority he worshipped. Instead, she thanked him, stood, and walked back to her office. A small island of analog sanity in a sea of neon-accented open-concept chaos. Into a cardboard box too flimsy for its emotional weight, she placed an aloe plant older than Colton, a titanium stapler from the era when office supplies were engineered instead of molded, and her personal network directory, handwritten and meticulously updated for decades, containing the private numbers of every inspector, vendor, council member, and regulatory figure in North Shore County. People whispered as she passed. Pity mixed with voyeurism, relieved it wasn't them. She didn't dignify them with acknowledgement. She walked out of the 22-story tower, across the sunlit plaza, and into her weathered Subaru with the quiet, deliberate movements of someone performing an autopsy on the present moment. She shut the door, set the box beside her, and didn't start the engine. She simply stared at the gleaming headquarters reflected in her windshield. She doesn't seem sad, and it seems she is calculating something. But calculation requires context, and context requires memory, which is why Mara stayed parked beneath the shadow of the tower as she dialed a number she hadn't touched in nearly a decade. The line rang twice before the familiar gravelly voice of her attorney, Leonard Shore, filtered through. Surprised, alert, like a man who'd been tapped on the shoulder by a ghost from an old case file. Their last conversation had been over a lease renegotiation. No one in Skyline's current leadership had bothered to review legacy documents. After all, we're beneath the attention span of trend-chasing executives. When she told Leonard she had been retired 10 minutes earlier, he hissed sympathetically and immediately shifted into attack mode. He offered the predictable remedy. Age discrimination, wrongful termination, retaliation. But litigation, Mara knew, was a slog through the mud. She didn't want mud. She wanted bedrock. She wanted something that would make Skyline feel the ground tilt beneath them. Which, ironically, brought her back to the ground itself. As she stared at the headquarters' gleaming steel skeleton, she drifted back 20 years. To a time when Skyline Freight Solutions was a panicked, debt-choked shell teetering after the logistics market collapse of the early 2000s. Mara had been young then, underpaid and underestimated, watching the founders. Two brothers with thinning hair and thinning options. Scramble to keep the lights on. They were so desperate, they were willing to sell the very land beneath their operations to a predatory developer. Except Mara, fresh from inheriting a quiet but substantial sum from her late aunt Corinne, a woman whose distrust of banks had filled her farmhouse walls with secret safes, recognized an opportunity disguised as rubble. She created Kresmer Properties LLC, naming it after the street where her aunt had lived and died, and approached the founders anonymously through Leonard. Kresmer offered slightly above market value and, most importantly, offered cash. Cash was oxygen to a suffocating company. The founders didn't ask questions. They just signed. The 99-year triple net lease that followed was thorough, sterile, and entirely overlooked by every executive who came afterward. Rent escalations, infrastructure responsibilities, tax burdens. All neatly theirs. But the clause Mara had lain like a coiled wire, subtle but deadly, was the one she wrote herself. No structural alterations. None. Without written approval from the landlord. Over time, the founders retired, new management arrived, private equity swooped in with glossy decks and shallow slogans, and no one ever bothered to investigate who Kresmer actually was. To them, Kresmer Properties LLC was a silent, faceless entity, receiving automated payments from accounting. To Mara, it was the lever beneath the fulcrum of the entire corporate edifice. Sitting in her car now, her box of belongings still untouched beside her, she felt no triumph. Only the cold, steel-edged clarity of a chess player realizing she'd been in checkmate position for 2 decades and was only now ready to move the queen. Skyline had fired an employee. They had forgotten they were renting from a landlord who never forgot anything. And today, that oversight was no longer a footnote. It was a weapon. If the leverage she held had once been theoretical, it became startlingly tangible the moment she stepped back into her brownstone. A narrow, sea-weathered building perched above the bay, humming with the quiet stability her professional life had lacked for years. The familiarity of the space grounded her, the ticking wall clock, the faint scent of lemon oil on the bookshelves, the muted roar of gulls drifting in from the harbor. All of it stood in stark contrast to the corporate chaos she had just left behind. She headed straight to her home office, a room that looked less like a workspace and more like a personal archive of decisions others had regretted underestimating. From the bottom drawer of a steel filing cabinet, she withdrew a leather-bound binder whose weight felt ceremonial. It contained the original Kresmer lease contract. 27 pages of airtight legal architecture. The paper still carried that soft, dusty scent of old toner and archival ink, like a relic from a time when documents were crafted rather than auto-generated. She flipped through the clauses with practiced fingers until she reached the one that mattered, Clause 14C. Structural interference and architectural integrity, the perfect pressure point. The clause explicitly barred the tenant, Skyline Freight Solutions, from altering any load-bearing walls, subflooring, ventilation channels, or electrical cores without Kresmer's formal written consent. Any violation constituted a material breach, granting the landlord the right to terminate the lease with 30 days' notice and demand full structural restoration at the tenant's expense. For 20 years, the clause had slept quietly, ignored by executives who assumed leases were just background noise on spreadsheets. But Mara had learned that the most powerful weapons are the ones people forget exist. She set the binder aside and opened her laptop. Habit more than hope nudged her to test her Skyline admin credentials. Credentials she suspected Colton's revitalization initiative hadn't gotten around to revoking yet. They worked. Of course they did. Within minutes, Mara was inside the internal construction planning system, a digital maze of proposals, timelines, procurement forms, and half-baked design concepts submitted by people who thought whimsy was a business strategy. She navigated to Colton Avery's project folder. The title alone told her everything she needed to know. The Idea Stadium Initiative. If hubris had a font, it would have been whatever he used. As she scrolled through annotated renderings, her expression didn't change, though the absurdity deepened. Colton planned an open-concept bullpen, a floating mezzanine, a tear-down zone where employees would smash outdated cubicle walls as a metaphoric alignment exercise. In the diagrams, several support beams were marked with a confident red X. Beams integral to the structural integrity of the entire West Wing. It got worse. A quick search through the city's online permitting system revealed exactly 0 applications filed for any structural work at Skyline's headquarters. No permits, no inspections, no compliance. Negligence braided with arrogance. Perfect. Mara closed the laptop with deliberate calm and rested her hand atop the leather binder. She felt no anger, only the satisfying precision of gears locking into place. They thought they owned the building, but the ground beneath their empire had always answered to her. The gears of opportunity had finally aligned, but opportunity alone does nothing without observation. Which is why, after closing the leather binder, Mara turned to the aging desktop tower humming beneath her office desk. If Kresmer's lease had given her authority, Skyline's own negligence gave her access. The outdated security system she had installed 12 years earlier, back when leadership still understood the value of maintenance, remained untouched by updates because IT had suffered from streamlining initiatives every year since. The irony was exquisite. The very cost-cutting measures Colton evangelized had left the digital gate wide open for her. She logged in using her old administrator credentials. They still worked flawlessly, proof that the infrastructure relied less on innovation and more on the quiet diligence of people like her. People Colton believed were relics. The grainy camera feeds flickered to life, showing the construction zone on the West Wing's 4th floor. And there he was. Colton Avery strutted across the dusty concrete like a motivational speaker who'd wandered onto a demolition site by accident. A contractor trailed behind him, shoulders tense, brow furrowed, clearly trying to persuade Colton that the thick concrete column he kept poking was not an aesthetic inconvenience, but a structural spine. Colton waved dramatically, miming an explosion with his hands, as though brute enthusiasm could replace engineering calculations. Mara paused the feed, zoomed in, and captured several crisp screenshots, Colton pointing at the column marked for removal, the contractor's horrified expression, a whiteboard sketch depicting the so-called Idea Stadium. Evidence. Not emotional, not speculative, but concrete, time-stamped proof of intent to violate Clause 14C. With a screenshot saved, she opened the county's online permit portal. A few keystrokes later, her suspicion was confirmed. Not a single permit had been filed for structural alterations, demolition, mechanical rerouting, or occupancy changes. 0. It was bureaucratic silence, the kind that screams negligence. The absence of paperwork would be as damning as any physical breach. Satisfied, she dialed Leonard. He answered on the second ring, sounding as though he'd been sitting beside the phone since their last call. Phase 1? He asked, cautious but energized. Begin drafting, she said. She heard him typing immediately. Leonard was a man who thrived on actionable verbs. But before he could ask when to file, she added, "Don't submit anything yet." She leaned back in her chair, listening to the waves outside her window. Let him dig deeper. Let him document his own incompetence. Colton would undoubtedly live stream progress. He never missed an opportunity for performative leadership. He would tweet slogans. He would conduct tours. He would metaphorically and literally swing a hammer at the foundation that held him up. And every swing would make Kresmer's case stronger. Mara's pulse remained steady. A calmness not of mercy, but of precision. People mistake revenge for rage, but rage is imprecise, sloppy. What she practiced was structural mathematics, pressure applied exactly where the framework was weakest. And Skyline's framework was already cracking. But structural mathematics becomes even more elegant when the subjects of the equation insist on documenting their own collapse, which is exactly what happened the following Friday. Mara, settling into her late morning ritual of loose leaf tea and quiet observation, opened Skyline's internal broadcast link, the one still accessible because no one had revoked her credentials, and found the screen filled with the grandiosity of a corporate pep rally masquerading as a strategic update. Skyline called it the Momentum Rally, a name so aggressively vapid that Mara wondered if Colton had focus grouped it with a room full of motivational posters. The atrium had been transformed into a forced cheer amphitheater, rented stage lights, an overpowered sound system, and a towering LED backdrop pulsing with words like elevate, liberate, innovate in fonts large enough to intimidate aircraft. Colton strafed across the stage wearing a headset mic he did not deserve, preaching innovation with the cadence of a man who confused shouting with leadership. He mocked legacy workflows and operational fossils, each jab directed at a workforce too exhausted to react. Employees clapped because the cameras were on. Their eyes, however, were as alive as unplugged monitors. Then came the renderings. Always the renderings. The screen showcased neon-lit collaboration pods, beanbag clusters arranged like children's play areas, and open-air hallways where two major structural columns had quietly disappeared, erased in the digital fantasy of an architect with no engineering clearance. Mara's hand paused halfway to her lips, tea cooling against her fingertips. Those columns weren't decorative. They supported the central server floors. Dense, humming stacks of freight routing and regulatory data. Removing them wouldn't create liberation, as Colton gleefully described. It would create what structural engineers politely call progressive failure, translation, sagging floors, shifting loads, and the slow, expensive death of a building someone else had paid millions to maintain. Yet there he stood, the prince of buzzwords, announcing with messianic excitement that Monday would be demolition day. "Everyone gets a mallet," he exclaimed, as if handing out weapons to untrained staff near live electrical panels were the height of synergistic team bonding. The atrium filled with dutiful applause, but the deadness behind those smiles told a more accurate story, dread-wearing corporate lanyards. Mara set her teacup down with surgical precision. Recklessness disguised as innovation was dangerous, yes. But recklessness performed publicly was a gift. This was no longer hypothetical risk. It was an imminent structural hazard, and if Colton insisted on making theater out of his incompetence, then she would ensure the final act had a proper audience. The kind that arrived wearing hard hats and jurisdictional authority. She reached for her phone. Not out of haste but purpose, Monday would not unfold the way Colton envisioned. If he wanted an audience for his mallet moment, she would provide one. Inspectors, fire marshals, compliance officers, and red tags that glowed like warning beacons. If Skyline wanted momentum, she would give them gravity. She moved through the evidence like a curator assembling an exhibit meant to indict rather than admire, because in truth, the work required the patience of a librarian and the precision of a surgeon. Saturday morning found Mara methodical and unhurried at her kitchen table, the leather binder open, her laptop humming, and a neat stack of printed screenshots, architectural blueprints, and certified deed copies arrayed like a small, terrible altar. Each file had a timestamp. Each image bore the tiny ghost of a cursor, marking Colton's theatrical gestures at the concrete column, the contractor's uneasy notes scrawled in the margins, the whiteboard sketch spelling out Idea Stadium in block letters, as if that phrase could perform structural miracles. She drafted the email to the Port Harbor Building Safety Division with the kind of bureaucratic clarity that leaves no room for interpretive dance. Subject line: urgent, unauthorized structural alteration at 1880 Cresslin Avenue. Life safety risk, followed by a concise, clinical body that summarized ownership, clause violation, and imminent hazard, and then the attachments. a certified copy of the Kresmer deed, the excerpted Clause 14C, high-resolution screenshots showing Colton pointing at the mark for removal columns, and a diagram her structural-savvy neighbor had helped her annotate that clearly indicated a gas conduit running less than 8 inches behind the drywall slated for theatrical demolition. She scheduled the dispatch for Monday at 9:12 a.m., a tiny, deliberate cruelty of timing. 10 minutes after Colton's event schedule had told employees to pick up mallets and start breaking barriers. She called Leonard and spoke in clipped sentences. He was already drafting eviction notices, but she instructed him. Don't file yet. Let the theater unfold. Let the hubris accumulate. Let them spend. Let them tweet their own indictment. Leonard's voice, equal parts alarm and admiration, warned, Mara, you understand this will halt operations. She listened to the implied question. Do you accept the consequences? And answered simply, I'm not halting it. Colton is... I'm documenting it. That distinction mattered to her. She was not the agent of chaos, but the recorder of it. The person who would force leadership to answer for choices they had made in public because they had decided spectacle was a strategy. The weekend passed with the quiet busyness of someone assembling an inevitable case. She printed originals, blueprinted copies of city filings, signed correspondence where previous managers had acknowledged structural vulnerabilities, maintenance invoices showing the server floor's bespoke requirements, and placed each into a numbered folder. She called a few favors. Barb at the county clerk's office printed a certified easement map. A retired structural engineer friend annotated load tables to underscore the risk of removing the east wing support. An old vendor confirmed via email that the server racks above the slated columns had been bolted to the floor for more than a decade. None of it felt like gloating. It felt like stewardship. There was a moral logic at work. An obligation to prevent foreseeable harm caused by managerial negligence masquerading as innovation. On Sunday night, she sat on her porch with a cup of unsweetened tea and watched the harbor lights blink in the distance, feeling the old, familiar hum of responsibility settle in her bones. She reviewed the checklist. Email scheduled, eviction paperwork ready but unfiled, backup key codes secured in the safe, Leonard on standby, and a curated set of clips ready to forward anonymously to the board and to any reporter who might find them newsworthy. The work was surgical, not visceral. Someone had to protect the building. Someone had to translate negligence into a matter for code officers and courts. The people inside the atrium might think they were swinging hammers at a symbolic past. She would make sure those swings hit the hard truth instead, that laws exist to prevent buildings from being reduced to props, and that sometimes the only way to enforce them is to let the performance complete itself so the citation is unmistakable. By Monday morning, all the pieces she had arranged over the weekend settled into place with the inevitability of a domino chain. The sky over Cresslin Avenue was a washed-out blue, the kind that offered no opinion on the events about to unfold. Mara chose a small corner table at a cafe directly across from Skyline's headquarters. A vantage point with perfect sightlines through the atrium's glass facade. She ordered a pot of Darjeeling, not because she needed calm, but because ritual gave purpose shape. At exactly 9:12 a.m., as scheduled, the email she'd queued dispatched itself to the Port Harbor Building Safety Division. A quiet, digital flare sent into bureaucratic heavens. She didn't need to refresh her inbox. She simply waited. At 10:03, punctual as only civil servants and code violations can inspire, a white city inspection vehicle rolled to a stop in front of the building. Seconds later, a fire marshal's SUV arrived, lights off but authority unmistakable. The two officials strode inside with the kind of purposeful gait that promised impending paperwork. Mara opened her laptop and checked the live security feed. Skyline's demolition day was fully underway, employees in matching hard hats. Branded, naturally. Stood clustered around designated impact zones, swinging mallets with the reluctant enthusiasm of people forced into weekend retreats. A DJ blasted aggressively cheerful pop music, trying to manufacture excitement from thin air, Colton was front and center, mid-performance, demonstrating the liberation of the workspace with a mallet nearly as large as his ego. Then the fire marshal reached the DJ booth, pulled the plug, and the music died as abruptly as a power outage at a rave. Silence fell over the atrium like a dropped curtain. Workers froze mid-swing. Dust settled in the sudden quiet. Colton pivoted with a grin already forming, until he saw the marshal's expression, which could have extinguished a much larger fire. The inspector unrolled a large blueprint onto a folding table, jabbing at crucial points: the endangered column, exit pathways, the server floor above. Mara watched as Colton attempted animated explanations. Wide-arm gestures, exaggerated optimism, the kind of hand-waving that had never once altered gravity. The inspector's face remained inert. Then the red citation pad appeared, a bureaucratic guillotine. Moments later, a stop work order placard was affixed to the glass doors. Bright, unmistakable, and deeply inconvenient for anyone whose job relied on pretending rules were optional. Phones were already out. Interns filmed everything with the reflexes of a generation conditioned to capture catastrophe. Within minutes, clips hit social media. Titles ranged from snarky to catastrophic. When your boss tries to demolish a load-bearing wall during a team event, corporate life, come for the paycheck, stay for the building code violations. One clip. Perfectly framed, perfectly damning. Showed Colton arguing with the inspector before dropping his mallet in defeat. Mara forwarded that one anonymously to Skyline's board. No commentary. No framing. She didn't need to narrate anything. The footage narrated itself, leadership collapsing under its own performance, incompetence documented in 1080p. If the morning had unfolded like a slow-motion implosion, by noon it had become a full-blown corporate earthquake. The stop work order spread across internal chats like a contagion. Investors called the board demanding explanations. Department heads scrambled to rewrite schedules. Employees fled the building carrying mallets they were no longer legally permitted to use. And at the center of the spiral was Everett Langford, Skyline's CEO, who arrived in a black sedan that screeched into the loading zone with all the subtlety of a crisis alarm. Everett rarely came to headquarters in person. His leadership style involved remote optimism and quarterly speeches from resort conference rooms. But seeing inspectors march through his atrium pulled him from the golf course of denial straight into the lobby of consequences. Live security feeds muted the sound, but Everett's expression was as clear as a headline: pure, incandescent fury. He jabbed a finger at Colton's chest with rhythmic intensity, each thrust a syllable of unspoken disappointment. Colton shrank, shoulders folding inward like paper. Meanwhile, Mara observed all of it from her cafe perch, her Darjeeling refilled, her posture relaxed. Not triumphant, just resolute. She picked up her phone and typed a message using the same number she'd once used to book Everett out of snowbound airports and reroute his flights around labor strikes. A number he still had saved. If you want clarity about the building, meet me across the street. Through the glass, she watched Everett pause mid-tirade as his phone buzzed. His eyes scanned the message, his breath visibly hitching. Confusion, recognition, reluctance, then inevitability. A few minutes later, he crossed the street with a gait that tried to project control but failed under the weight of unfolding disaster. He didn't sit when he reached her table. He didn't greet her. He simply launched. Rapid-fire questions, frantic demands, half-formed solutions. What happened? What did they violate? How fast can we get permits? What will it cost? Who do we pay? How do we make this go away? Mara let him exhaust himself. She offered no nods, no affirmations. She stirred her tea. When his questions collapsed into a frustrated silence, she finally answered. Not with a solution, but with a truth he had never imagined. Everett, she said calmly, I don't approve structural changes because I am the landlord. Kresmer Properties is me. The sentence didn't hit him all at once. It unfolded through him slowly, rewiring assumptions he'd held for years. His eyes flickered through disbelief, then recognition, then something akin to dread. The woman he had allowed to be fired 3 days earlier. Dismissed as a relic. Owned the land beneath the headquarters and the contract governing every square foot inside it. He sat down then. Hard. Mara continued. I don't want money. I want accountability. She laid out her terms with the unshakable clarity of someone who had waited decades for this moment. Reinstatement of pension cuts, public acknowledgement that the so-called Cultural Reinvention Initiative was a managerial failure, and the complete dissolution of Colton's authority. Everett balked, sputtering objections about shareholders and optics. Mara merely glanced across the street toward the bright red stop work order. The tag stays, she said, until I sign off. And I won't. Not under him. Not under you as things stand. Everett realized, finally and fully, that he wasn't in a negotiation, he was in a reckoning. But Everett, even after the revelation that the ground beneath his company belonged to the woman he had discarded like office surplus, still fundamentally misunderstood her position. He believed, because men like Everett always believed, that every conflict could be repaved with money, influence, or a reshuffled org chart. In his mind, Mara had to want something transactional, reinstatement, a consultancy, a compensation package padded with performance bonuses. Something that would let the board save face while restoring her as a functional cog in the same machine that had tossed her out. But Mara wanted neither reinstatement nor revenge as spectacle. What she demanded were truths the board had refused to face and reparations for the employees sacrificed in the name of cultural reinvention. So she presented her terms with the clarity of a structural report, restore the pensions, publicly acknowledge that the strategic overhaul was a managerial failure, and issue a formal apology, not whispered, not buried in HR memos. Public. Documented. Irrefutable. Everett stared at her as if she had asked him to crawl across broken glass. To him, her terms represented humiliation. A confession carved in permanent ink. And humiliation was a language he refused to speak. So he countered, scrambling for leverage, increased rent payments, upgraded tenant amenities, promises to oust Colton immediately and replace him with someone seasoned. Mara declined each offer with the same quiet tone she had used when she picked up the pot of tea earlier. The lease violation was not a hiccup. It was structural sabotage. She could not, and would not, pretend otherwise to satisfy a man desperate to salvage his image. Everett's composure frayed. He leaned back, nostrils flaring, and invoked the threat he always imagined sat on the highest rung of corporate power, litigation. Skyline, he boasted, had an expansive legal team. They would bury Kresmer Properties in motions, delays, injunctions. They would tie the matter in knots until Mara yielded. Mara took a slow sip of her tea, not to stall, but because calm was her strongest rhetorical device. Everett, she said, my lawyers drafted your lease. They understand it better than yours ever will. She reminded him that the court system moved at a glacial pace, but stop work orders did not, investor patience did not. Lease termination timelines certainly did not. And the red tag on his building was already eroding his power more quickly than any judge could intervene. Everett's jaw locked, his pride mounting a final, futile defense. Then he stood, pushing away from the table with enough force to rattle the saucers. We'll fight this, he snapped before storming across the street, shoulders squared against a wind that didn't exist. Mara watched him stride into the atrium, into his own slow failure, and then picked up her phone. She typed a single message to Leonard. He declined. File the notice. There was no smile on her face, no triumphant swell. For Mara, vengeance was not emotional. It was engineering. Calculating load paths, identifying critical weaknesses, and applying pressure until a structure that believed itself immovable remembered that all things, under the right force, can bend or break. Pressure applied to the right fault line rarely stays contained, and by the afternoon of the eviction filing, the crack had widened into a citywide spectacle. Because filings are public records, and because business journalists in Port Harbor can smell corporate blood with shark-like intuition, the story surfaced within hours. The headline, bold and gleefully alarmist, sprawled across the Port Harbor Ledger's website. Freight giant faces eviction after unauthorized HQ renovation. The article was thorough enough to sting, references to building code violations, unpermitted demolition, and a mysteriously faceless landlord executing a long-slumbering lease clause. By closing bell, Skyline Freight stock had dipped 3%, a small numerical shift but a catastrophic symbolic one for a company that marketed itself on unshakable operational stability. Inside the displaced workforce, panic simmered into disarray. Employees, now working from dining tables, parked cars, and borrowed co-working spaces, joined impromptu video calls trying to decode rumor from truth. Who was Kresmer Properties? Why were they being evicted? And had Colton Avery actually tried to knock down a load-bearing column during a morale event? Screenshots circulated. Silent video clips spread. The iconography of incompetence traveled faster than any internal memo. Everett, scrambling for footing, sought an emergency injunction claiming Kresmer Properties had acted in bad faith and that Mara's enforcement was retaliatory. Leonard countered in crisp legal filings that Skyline had committed a material breach, endangered employees, and violated municipal permitting laws. A trifecta of negligence any judge would take seriously. A hearing was set for Thursday. Skyline's board, desperate to demonstrate decisiveness, ejected Colton from the company with such efficiency it nearly qualified as performance art. He left the nearly condemned building flanked by security, hood pulled over his head, walking fast enough to blur. A reporter shouted a question about load-bearing walls. He didn't answer. His departure quieted one problem but illuminated another. Firing a figurehead didn't restore legal occupancy. The stop work order remained. The lease termination process ticked forward like a metronome. And the headquarters. Skyline's beating heart of freight routing, compliance operations, and client coordination was now an empty steel box they no longer had the right to enter. Operations faltered. Spreadsheets timed out. Client delays accumulated. A logistics empire incapable of locating its own ground made for an irony so sharp Mara could have framed it. She watched all of this unfold through a mixture of inevitability and obligation. The legal process was moving, yes, but she wasn't at the crescendo yet. Not even close. The point of structural pressure was not simply collapse, it was demonstration, teaching, reorientation. Skyline believed efficiency was its identity. Now it couldn't coordinate a meeting room, a Wi-Fi network, or a functional executive chain. And in the growing void of certainty, one truth was beginning to crystallize for everyone except Everett. Mara had not acted out of fury, but out of structural logic. The company had destabilized itself. She was merely allowing the consequences to settle in. By Thursday morning, the courthouse felt less like a civic building and more like a pressure chamber for collapsing corporate reputations. Skyline's legal team arrived in a formation that suggested intimidation was a strategy. 3 attorneys in tailored suits, rolling cases full of exhibits they hoped might distract from the core truth. Everett trailed behind them, looking frayed. Tie loosened, hair disobedient, confidence patchy. Mara entered with none of their theatrics. She carried a single slim folder, her steps unhurried, her posture steady. Leonard walked beside her, calm as a metronome. In the courtroom, Judge Corinne Adler presided. A woman known locally for her intolerance of nonsense and her particular respect for building codes. She began by reviewing the emergency injunction Skyline had requested. Their lead attorney argued passionately that Kresmer Properties was acting punitively, that the stop work conditions were exaggerated, that the breach was minor, and that evicting a critical logistics employer would cause irreparable economic harm. It was a performance of polished rhetoric, but rhetoric does not reinforce beams. When the judge turned to Leonard, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He simply submitted the photographs, the live stream excerpts, the permit history, or lack thereof, and Clause 14C. Highlighted, printed, stamped. Skyline Freight, he said evenly, attempted to remove a load-bearing column without a permit during a public corporate event. The fire marshal's order stands. The lease terms stand. Kresmer Properties is acting to prevent structural collapse, not to inflict reputational damage. The damage was self-inflicted. Judge Adler examined the evidence, her brow tightening with each page. When she finally looked up, her gaze sliced straight through Skyline's counsel. A minor infraction, she repeated. This is not redecorating a lobby. This is attempted demolition of critical supports. Your client breached the lease and endangered its workforce. Everett shifted, shrinking into his chair. The ruling came swiftly. Injunction denied. Eviction process validated. 7 days to vacate. No extensions. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Shock from Skyline's side, relief from Leonard's, and a quiet, satisfied certainty from Mara? Not joy. Certainty. Outside the courthouse doors, reporters fired questions like grape shot. Everett pushed past them, muttering about appeals, shareholder updates, crisis communications. His attorneys huddled, already drafting statements trying to frame the disaster as an unexpected facilities challenge. But language could not unwrite a court order. Mara stood a short distance away, observing, neither hiding nor inserting herself. She did not need to. The narrative was moving under its own momentum now. She texted Leonard a simple acknowledgement. Proceed. And watched as the corporate structure that had once dismissed her began to bend under the weight of its own oversights. She had not caused Skyline to fail. She had merely revealed the fault lines they had built into themselves. And the building, her building, would no longer carry their negligence quietly. The judge's ruling hit Skyline with the speed of a collapsing scaffold. By Friday morning, the headquarters resembled a disturbed ant colony. Hundreds of workers scurrying through the glass atrium, packing boxes with frantic urgency while supervisors barked contradictory instructions. The very company that once lectured about fluid adaptability now struggled to coordinate its own evacuation. Operations teams tried to preserve freight routing schedules with laptops perched on cardboard, while IT specialists begged anyone who would listen not to unplug servers without warning. But warnings no longer mattered. The stop work order barred technical staff from entering restricted zones, and the eviction clock ticked down with bureaucratic indifference. Mara watched from a discreet distance, parked beneath the shade of a modest magnolia tree across the street. She didn't savor the chaos. What she felt instead was the familiar heaviness of someone who understood systems. Not just structural ones, but human ones. People inside that building had mortgages, aging parents, student loans. They hadn't created the crisis. They were simply trapped in its fallout. So when Tyler, a junior systems analyst who had once repaired her printer with quiet competence, called in a near-whispered panic, she answered. He explained that the forced shutdowns were corrupting routing archives, threatening years of client data. Clients that, in truth, Mara respected far more than the executives who mismanaged them. Back up everything to the cloud, she told him. Use the encryption key in the safe in my old office. Code is 271 Thasor. And Tyler, don't tell management. Just save the data. She knew he would follow instructions. Some employees still understood fundamentals. Protect the foundation first, inside the building. Emotions simmered into open resentment. Rumors swirled. About the breach, about Kresmer's identity, about Colton's spectacular fall. Someone had found the viral video of him arguing with the fire marshal, and it circulated through team chats faster than leadership could contain it. For once, the interns weren't the ones whispering. Directors were. Middle managers spoke of catastrophic negligence. Teams quietly documented their own department's repeated warnings about infrastructure vulnerabilities. The truth, long suppressed beneath layers of branded optimism, resurfaced like a cracked beam in sunlight. Skyline hadn't been modernizing. It had been decaying. By Sunday, moving trucks lined the block. Security guards escorted employees in timed intervals, enforcing a strict exit protocol mandated by the sheriff's office. The company that once touted uninterrupted global coordination now couldn't coordinate which elevator to use. Furniture was hauled out with reckless haste. Ergonomic chairs scraped across concrete. Whiteboards lost their wheels. A foosball table from Colton's Idea Stadium initiative splintered as it was shoved into a truck too small to hold it. Even the once imposing LED Elevate, Liberate, Innovate sign flickered uncertainly before being dismantled. To anyone else, it might have looked like collapse. To Mara, it looked like the natural consequence of ignoring structural reality. Her goal had never been ruin. It was correction. Systems fail when leaders believe branding can defy physics, and now Skyline, stripped of pretense, was confronting the laws it had pretended didn't apply. The building stood quiet behind the chaos, as if relieved to finally be taken seriously. By the sixth night of Skyline's frantic evacuation, the block around 1880 Crestline Avenue had grown unnervingly quiet. The moving trucks were gone. The parking lot, once crammed with the cars of 300 employees, now sat mostly empty. Rows of faded lines holding nothing but the echo of a company that had assumed permanence. Mara waited until nearly midnight before driving across town, guided not by vengeance but by duty. If she had learned anything in her decades of operations, it was this: systems deserved closure, and structures deserved respect. She parked beneath a flickering street lamp, the same one she used to walk past on late nights during audit season, and approached the headquarters with the slow reverence of someone returning to a place that had forgotten her before remembering her too late. The building loomed in the dark. Steel, glass, and silence. No voices. No humming AC. No neon slogans pulsing against the interior walls. Only the muted glow of exit signs and the faint, intermittent strobe of a malfunctioning motion sensor. She entered the lobby with the temporary access she still legally possessed. Her footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, a sound that felt both triumphant and elegiac. This was where she'd fixed broken badge scanners during holiday weekends. This was where new hires had shaken her hand thinking she was just operations, unaware that she kept their entire workflow from collapsing. Now, the atrium felt hollow without people to anchor it. On the fourth floor, her former office still bore the remnants of the innovation overhaul that had never materialized. Half-painted accent walls, sticky notes with meaningless slogans, and a mood board someone abandoned mid-pivot. A discarded mallet lay in the corner, its rubber head coated in drywall dust. Mara picked it up, weighed it, and placed it gently on a filing cabinet as though returning a dangerous object to the correct shelf. She moved room by room, checking that no forgotten equipment or sensitive documents remained. Years of habit guided her. She verified that emergency exits latched properly, inspected the server floor's environmental controls, still offline, and ensured that no contractor had left unsecured wiring exposed. The building, despite everything, was structurally sound. Untouched only because she had intervened early enough, it struck her then that she wasn't just protecting property. She was protecting the legacy of every person who had ever worked here with earnestness rather than ego. By the time she returned to the lobby, the sky had shifted from deep indigo to pale gray. The first suggestion of dawn. She stepped outside, exhaling into the cool air. Today, at 9 o'clock sharp, the sheriff's department would arrive to enforce the formal lockout. Everett would still be drafting statements. The board would still be panicking. Employees would still be adjusting to temporary workspaces. But the building, the only entity in this entire saga that had never deluded itself, would finally be reclaimed. Mara touched the exterior stone near the cornerstone, feeling the chill of it. "You're safe now," she murmured, not sentimentally, but truthfully. She wasn't here to celebrate victory. She was here to confirm that the structure she had safeguarded for decades was ready for the final countdown. The morning of the lockout arrived with an indifferent sky. A slate-gray stretch of cloud that offered no commentary on the upheaval it was about to witness. At precisely 9 o'clock, 2 sheriff's deputies pulled into the loading zone in a marked county vehicle. Their arrival drew a small cluster of onlookers, a few employees who had returned hoping to retrieve forgotten items, a pair of board members pretending they just happened to be nearby, and Everett himself, who stood rigidly beside the revolving doors as though proximity might somehow rewrite the ruling. But rulings, as Mara knew, were like load paths. Once determined, they channeled force in one direction only. She waited until the deputies had finished their procedural briefing, then stepped out of her Subaru with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the tension around her. One deputy greeted her by name. She had filed the paperwork flawlessly, after all, and handed her the lock change authorization. Everett watched her approach the doors, his expression a haunted mixture of disbelief, resentment, and the dawning comprehension that this moment was irreversible. When the deputy announced, "Possession now transfers to Kresmer Properties," Everett exhaled the quiet, final breath of a person realizing the ground they once confidently strode across had never belonged to them. Employees trickled out carrying last-minute boxes, plants, monitors, desk tchotchkes. Some looked embarrassed, some exhausted, some quietly relieved. The sight of Mara standing near the entrance sent ripples of confusion through the crowd. Some recognized her, others whispered guesses, a few stared openly. She offered no explanations. The sheriff's deputies did that for her by handing her the new keys. The symbolic inversion was absolute. Days earlier, she had walked out with a cardboard box as a dismissed legacy worker. Now executives walked out with cardboard boxes under the authority of her signature. Inside the now vacant headquarters, the shift was palpable. Offices once filled with chatter and fluorescent hums now carried the echo of footsteps and the hollow resonance of emptied rooms. Mara moved through the lobby with professional detachment, verifying that lock changes were accurate, signage was removed, and remaining fixtures were secure. She paused at the base of the stairwell leading to the mezzanine Colton had once planned to demolish. Still standing, still sound, spared entirely by her intervention. Outside, Everett approached her, no longer with bluster but with bewildered desperation. "You've destroyed us," he said quietly, voice frayed. Mara turned, leveling a measured gaze at him. "No," she corrected. "You destroyed your own foundation. I merely enforced the load limits." He shook his head, unable to reconcile the past week with his understanding of authority. He had never considered that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding the deed. When he finally walked away, it was not with anger, but with the defeated posture of a man forced to confront a truth too unflattering to deflect. Incompetence collapses faster than concrete. As the deputies finished sealing the final access points, Mara accepted the ring of keys. Cool metal, heavy, real, and stepped fully inside a building that had always been hers, even when they'd forgotten it. Once the deputies departed and the last of Skyline's personnel drifted away like dust shaken loose from a long-disturbed surface, the building settled into a silence it had not known in decades. It wasn't the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of reclamation. of a structure finally relieved from the strain of being misunderstood, mismanaged, and nearly mutilated by executives who confused enthusiasm with expertise. Mara walked the perimeter of the lobby with unhurried steps, each footfall echoing off marble and glass in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. The headquarters, stripped of employees and branding, revealed its truest form, a meticulously engineered framework built by people who respected materials, not buzzwords. She stepped into her former office one last time. Not to reclaim it, but to acknowledge the history it represented. The walls were still half-painted in the color palette Colton had championed for innovation zones. The discarded decor attempts were scattered like abandoned metaphors. A corkboard labeled Idea Futures lay on the floor, trampled and bent. Mara righted it, not out of sentiment but out of habit. Order, and after all, was its own language. For a moment, she stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, observing the city below. Ferries cutting slow lines across the bay, pedestrians weaving through their morning routines, delivery trucks pulsing along the waterfront arterial like blood cells in an urban vein. Life continued with quiet efficiency, indifferent to corporate theatrics, and that, she reflected, was the essence of systems. The world didn't halt when leadership stumbled, it merely redistributed weight. She pulled out her notebook and jotted a short list. Not of revenge, but of restoration. Potential tenants who valued infrastructure over optics, nonprofits needing stable offices, community groups seeking training spaces, perhaps even a maritime institute looking for a satellite hub. The building deserved occupants who would treat it as a foundation, not a prop in a yet another rebranding initiative. Kresmer Properties could afford to be selective. As she exited the fourth floor, she encountered Sheila, Skyline's HR representative, who had returned to retrieve a forgotten succulent from her desk. Sheila stopped short at the sight of her. "Mara, it was you," she breathed, not accusingly, but with a kind of astonished reverence. Mara offered a small nod. "Take your time," she said. "There's no rush now." Sheila looked around the bare office walls, then back at her. "You're a legend. Everyone's terrified." "Good," Mara replied with a dry smile. "Terror keeps people on schedule." But beneath the humor was truth. Consequences exist not to frighten, but to realign, and Skyline had needed realignment more desperately than it ever understood. With the keys in her hand and the sun beginning to break through the gray horizon, Mara walked out of the headquarters for the final time. Not as an employee discarded by a short-sighted system, but as the steward of a structure she had saved twice, once when she bought its land, and again when she prevented its collapse. She locked the doors, fed her cat when she got home, and allowed herself, finally, a cup of tea steeped without urgency, not as victory, as equilibrium restored.